On the morning of February 28, 2026, within hours of the first American and Israeli missiles striking Tehran, a man named Khalid Azizi received a phone call he had been half expecting for years. Azizi is the spokesperson for the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the oldest Kurdish opposition group in Iran, founded in 1945, banned in 1979, and operating ever since, from bases in the mountains of northern Iraq, while its members inside Iran were imprisoned, executed, or silenced. The phone call was about an opportunity. The United States and Israel had just struck the Islamic Republic. The supreme leader was dead. The IRGC was absorbing the most devastating air campaign against Iran in its history. The Kurdish groups that had been fighting the Islamic Republic off and on across decades were asking the same question simultaneously. Is this finally the moment? Azizi told Fox News Digital 3 weeks later that the answer, for now, was not yet. "We are ready," he said, "but we are waiting to see how this unfolds." Well, that answer, ready but waiting, has defined the Kurdish posture in this war since February 28th, and understanding why reveals something important about a front in the Iran war that has not received anything like the attention it deserves, because it has the potential to open a wound inside the Islamic Republic that no American missile has yet been able to create. The coalition that formed in the weeks after February 28th is called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan, and it is the most significant unified Kurdish political and military structure opposing the Islamic Republic that has existed in decades. It brings together 5 organizations with very different histories, ideologies, and command structures, held together by the shared conclusion that a weakened Islamic Republic under American and Israeli bombardment represents an opening that may not come again. The Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the KDPI, led by Mustafa Hijri, is the oldest and most established. It was the KDPI that declared the first Kurdish autonomous republic in Iran in 1945, the Mohabbat Republic, which lasted 11 months before Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi crushed it with Iranian troops. The KDPI has been fighting the Islamic Republic since 1979 with varying intensity and from bases in Iraqi Kurdistan that the IRGC has struck multiple times, including a ballistic missile attack in 2018 on the party's headquarters in Khoisanjak that killed 18 people and wounded dozens, including Azizi himself. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, or PAK, based also in Iraq's Kurdistan region, has been the most operationally active of the coalition groups in the months since the war began, claiming multiple attacks on IRGC positions in Kermanshah and Loristan provinces inside western Iran. The Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, is the most ideologically complex member, an offshoot of the PKK founded specifically to operate inside Iran from bases in the Kandil Mountains near the Iran-Iraq border. Its armed wing, the Eastern Kurdistan Units, or YRK, is assessed by outside analysts as fielding the most capable fighters in the coalition, many of them women with combat experience stretching back years. Kabat and Kamala are smaller organizations rounding out the 5-party structure, each with their own armed Peshmerga forces and long histories of resistance. Combined, the coalition's fighter strength runs into what independent analysts and Kurdish leaders themselves describe as the high thousands. That number sounds significant until it is placed alongside the context that makes it complicated. The fighters are spread across a border region that extends roughly 500 kilometers along the Iran-Iraq frontier. They are lightly equipped compared to the IRGC ground forces they would face if a full offensive were attempted. They are operating from Iraqi Kurdistan, a semi-autonomous region of Iraq, whose government has its own careful relationship with Tehran and whose 2 main political parties, the KDP led by Masoud Barzani and the PUK led by Bafel Talabani, have not endorsed or directly supported the coalition's operations. Trump called both Barzani and Talabani after the war began, a call whose precise content was not disclosed, but that was understood as Washington seeking to understand the Kurdish situation in Iraq as part of a broader regional calculus. Reports that Trump had also called KDPI leader Hijri directly were never confirmed. The KDPI's executive board member Hassan Sharifi said the call simply did not happen. Iran understood what the Kurdish coalition's formation meant and responded to it before the coalition had made a single significant military move inside Iran. Starting on February 28th, the same day Operation Epic Fury began, Iran launched a series of ballistic missile and drone attacks against the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Most of the roughly 200 strikes Iran directed at Iraqi territory by March 11th targeted the Kurdistan region specifically, because the Kurdistan region is where the Kurdish coalition groups have their headquarters, their training facilities, their weapon storage, and their commanders. The Islamic Republic, its hands full with American and Israeli air campaigns targeting its nuclear program, ballistic missile sites, naval infrastructure, and IRGC command posts, simultaneously directed a sustained bombardment at the Kurdish opposition groups on its western flank, treating the coalition's formation as an urgent threat requiring immediate preemptive action. That assessment tells you something about how seriously Tehran's military planners regard the Kurdish factor. The strikes killed 6 Peshmerga fighters, wounded 44 others, killed 1 Asayish intelligence operative and wounded 1 more, and killed 10 members of opposition organizations while wounding others. American, British, French, and Italian air defense assets based in the Kurdistan region, including Patriot batteries and British rapid sentry systems, engaged a significant fraction of the incoming missiles and drones. At least 60 Iranians were killed in retaliatory U.S. airstrikes against the attacking forces. The casualty toll on the Kurdish and Allied side was real but contained. What Iran was trying to achieve with the strikes was not primarily physical destruction of Kurdish forces, whose fighters are dispersed and mobile, and who have decades of experience surviving exactly this kind of targeting. Iran was trying to demonstrate to the Barzani and Talabani-led Kurdistan regional government that hosting the coalition came with a price, and to demonstrate to the coalition itself that Tehran was watching and was willing to escalate against its rear area, regardless of what else was happening on every other front. The Atlantic Council's analysis from March 6th laid out what a genuine Kurdish offensive inside Iran would look like strategically, and why it would be more consequential than anything the coalition could achieve in the near term from its current position. The assessment, written by analysts who had been tracking the Kurdish groups for years, pointed to the specific vulnerability the coalition could exploit. Iran's western provinces of Kurdistan, Kermanshah, Elam, and West Azerbaijan have Kurdish majority or significant Kurdish minority populations that have historically had fraught relationships with the Islamic Republic, intensified dramatically by the Mahsa Amini protests of 2022 to 2023, and the regime's violent suppression of those protests, which had their largest and most sustained manifestations in Kurdish-populated areas. A military force entering Iranian Kurdistan from the west would not necessarily be entering hostile terrain. It might be entering terrain where the local population's relationship with the regime's security forces was already badly damaged. The PJAK's YRK fighters, operating from the Kandil Mountains near the Iranian border, have been conducting what the organization describes as resistance operations inside Iran since well before the 2026 war began. These are not massed infantry assaults. They are the classic tactics of a force that is outgunned but not outmaneuvered. Ambushes of IRGC patrols, attacks on border posts, targeted strikes against IRGC infrastructure in remote mountain areas, and the kind of persistent low-level pressure that ties down security forces without offering a concentrated target for retaliation. PAK's attacks in Kermanshah and Loristan provinces have followed a similar pattern, with the organization claiming strikes on IRGC positions throughout the spring and into the summer. Newsweek's July 2nd report confirmed that Kurdish attacks on Iranian territory had been rising during the ceasefire period, which is the precise opposite of what a ceasefire usually produces, because the Kurdish groups are not party to any ceasefire agreement between Washington and Tehran and are not bound by the Islamabad MOU that briefly appeared to be ending the war. The strategic value of this persistent pressure, even at its current low intensity, is disproportionate to the number of fighters involved. Every IRGC unit that has to maintain a posture against Kurdish insurgent activity on the western flank is a unit that is not available to reinforce positions elsewhere. Every checkpoint, every patrol route, every security sweep in Kurdish-populated areas requires manpower that comes from somewhere. Iran's security apparatus is not infinite, and the war with the United States has already been consuming enormous resources in terms of missiles, drones, naval assets, air defense capabilities, and command personnel. Adding a persistent insurgent threat on the western border, even one that has not yet reached the scale of a full offensive, is a meaningful additional drain on a security structure that was already under extraordinary stress before the Kurdish coalition completed its formation. The reason the full offensive has not materialized is a convergence of factors that the Palladium magazine analysis from March 28th documented with unusual precision in a piece titled "How the Kurdish Offensive in Iran Unraveled." The headline is slightly misleading because there was not a planned offensive that failed. There was a planned offensive that was deferred, pending conditions that had not yet arrived. The primary constraint is Turkey. Ankara regards the PJAK as an extension of the PKK, which Turkey designates as a terrorist organization and has been fighting inside its own borders and across the Iraqi frontier for decades. Turkey's President Erdogan has been navigating a careful neutrality in the Iran war, maintaining economic relationships with Iran, refusing to close Turkish airspace to Iranian supply flights, and repeatedly warning that any outcome that empowers Kurdish armed groups on its southern flank would be unacceptable, regardless of what those groups were doing to a government Turkey itself regards as problematic. Sangar Khalil, an expert on Kurdish affairs quoted in the Palladium analysis, described Turkey's opposition as the decisive external break on any large-scale Kurdish ground offensive. The heavily armed Kurdish groups that would emerge from a successful offensive inside Iran were precisely the cross-border threat Turkey has been trying to prevent through decades of operations against the PKK and its affiliates. The second constraint is purely military. The Atlantic Council's assessment and the Palladium analysis both reached the same conclusion on this point. While American and Israeli airstrikes had significantly degraded IRGC infrastructure and capabilities in the opening months of the war, the IRGC's ground forces remained largely intact. The missiles, the drones, the naval vessels, the air defense systems, and the command posts had taken real damage. The infantry divisions and armored brigades that would meet a Kurdish ground offensive at the border had not. A Kurdish force in the high thousands, lightly equipped, entering terrain where the IRGC could concentrate mechanized infantry without worrying about American air cover that has not been specifically tasked to support Kurdish operations, would be advancing against an enemy that was outgunned, out-armored, and capable of calling in artillery and armed drones that the Kurdish coalition has no equivalent counter to. The coalition's leaders understand this. Hassan Sharifi, the KDPI executive board member who confirmed Trump's call never happened, and who has spent his career in a party that has been fighting the Islamic Republic since before most of its current members were born, has no illusions about the difference between a guerrilla campaign and a conventional ground offensive. Going it alone, the Palladium analysis concluded in the words of people familiar with the coalition's own deliberations, would be suicidal. What the coalition has been doing instead is patient and calculated. PAK's attacks in Kermanshah and Loristan are ongoing. PJAK's YRK operations from Kandil continue. The coalition maintains the coordinating structure it built in the weeks after February 28th, preserving the political and military relationships that would allow it to scale operations if conditions change. It is watching for three things that its members have described in various interviews with international media since March: a significant degradation of IRGC ground force capacity inside the western provinces, an explicit signal from Washington that Kurdish operations would receive air cover or other support, and a continued deterioration of the Islamic Republic's domestic political legitimacy in Kurdish-populated areas that might transform the terrain from merely sympathetic to actively supportive. The first has not yet happened to the degree the coalition requires. The second has not been given. The third has been progressing gradually, driven by the Amini protest legacy and by the economic devastation the war has brought to a Western Iran that was already significantly poorer than the country's interior before February 28th. The Iranian strikes on Kurdish headquarters in the Kurdistan region are themselves a form of evidence that Tehran regards the coalition as a threat serious enough to warrant continued attention and military resources. Iran fired roughly 200 missiles and drones at Iraqi Kurdistan in the first 2 weeks of the war alone. It has continued periodic strikes since. Each strike confirms that Iran's military planners do not regard the Kurdish front as a manageable irritant. They regard it as a potential secondary front that could open in ways that are very difficult to manage if the primary confrontation with the United States has already consumed the best of their mobile reserves and degraded their ability to project force inside their own western provinces. The question of what changes for this calculation if the current Oman talks produce a ceasefire is genuinely important and genuinely uncertain. A ceasefire between Washington and Tehran would not bind the Kurdish coalition, which is not party to those talks, and which the Iranian government regards as a terrorist organization rather than a legitimate negotiating counterparty. A ceasefire that restores Iran's oil revenue and reduces the pressure of the American blockade would also restore the financial resources the IRGC needs to maintain its operations along the western border, and to fund the kind of sustained security presence in Kurdish-populated provinces that suppresses insurgent activity. A ceasefire that ends the American air campaign removes the strategic context that has been the Kurdish coalition's primary argument for scaling up operations, that Iran is weakened, distracted, and under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and that now is the moment. If the American campaign pauses or ends, that argument weakens. If the American campaign continues, the argument strengthens. The Kurdish coalition is watching the Oman talks with the same attention as the oil traders and the Gulf Arab governments. For the same reason, what happens next in the primary conflict determines the conditions under which a secondary front can either open or close. Ready but waiting. That was Azizi's formulation in March. The Kurdish fighters in the Kandil Mountains and along the Kermanshah border are still in that posture as of August. The coalition exists. The attacks continue at low intensity. The strategic opening they are waiting for has not fully arrived. Whether it arrives depends on decisions being made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, and Muscat that have nothing to do with Kurdish politics, and everything to do with whether the war produces a collapse of Iranian state capacity that creates the opening, or a negotiated settlement that restores enough of that capacity to close it again before the high thousands of Kurdish fighters waiting in the mountains of northern Iraq decide that waiting is no longer the right answer. There is a dimension of the Kurdish story that sits deeper than the immediate military calculus, and that requires understanding the specific weight of history that the Islamic Republic carries on its western frontier. Iran's Kurdish population, estimated at somewhere between 8 and 12% of the total population of roughly 85 million people, is concentrated in provinces that share a long border with Iraq and Turkey, provinces that have been administered from Tehran across multiple governments and regimes since the fall of the Mohammed Republic in 1946. The Islamic Republic inherited a relationship with the Kurdish population that was already troubled and proceeded to make it worse through a combination of policies that human rights organizations have documented in detail: the execution of Kurdish political activists, the imprisonment of civil society leaders, restrictions on Kurdish language education and cultural expression, and the periodic crackdown on coal bars, the cross-border porters who carry goods across the Iran-Iraq border and who have been shot by border guards for the economic crime of earning a living. The 2022 Mahsa Amini protests produced the most visible rupture in that relationship in decades. Kurdish cities went dark for days at a time as collective shutdowns protested the death of a Kurdish woman in the custody of the Islamic Republic's morality police. The protests lasted longer in Kurdish provinces than anywhere else in Iran. And the security response, including the killing of demonstrators and the imprisonment of thousands, left a scar that has not healed and that was still raw when February 28th arrived. The New Lines magazine, reporting from March, which sent a journalist to the mountain bases of the Kamala organization and other coalition groups, captured the specific texture of how the coalition's fighters were thinking about the population question. Kamala's leadership described the protests of 2022 as a genuine social uprising that demonstrated the existence of a constituency inside Iranian Kurdistan that shared the coalition's objective of ending Islamic Republic rule, even if those civilians were not prepared to take up arms themselves. The fighters in the mountain bases described themselves as the organized military expression of an unorganized popular sentiment, waiting for the moment when the conditions allowed that popular sentiment to become active support rather than passive sympathy. Active support means intelligence on IRGC positions, safe houses, movement corridors for fighters, early warning about security sweeps, and the kind of local knowledge that transforms a guerrilla force from an outsider army to something that moves through a population the way water moves through rock. The coalition does not yet have that in the form it needs for a sustained ground campaign. Whether the combination of the war, the economic devastation the war has brought to Western Iran, and the continued presence of a security apparatus that killed civilians in Kurdish cities during the 2022 protests is gradually creating it, is the intelligence question that the coalition's commanders think about every day. The population inside Iran that has been watching the war from inside Iranian Kurdistan has no public voice because the Islamic Republic's surveillance infrastructure inside the country has not collapsed the way its naval assets and missile storage sites have. But the reporting that does emerge from journalists and researchers who maintain contact with sources inside Iran suggests a population that has been absorbing the economic consequences of the war, the fuel shortages, the food supply disruption, the currency collapse, without the counterbalancing narrative of national pride that the Islamic Republic has been trying to supply. The Mahsa Amini slogan, "Woman Life, Freedom," has not disappeared. The people who chanted it in Kurdish cities in 2022 are still there. They are watching the war. They are watching the Islamic Republic's reaction to the war. They are watching the Kurdish coalition's presence in the mountains. What they do with all of that watching, if the window opens and the high thousands of fighters in the Kandil Mountains come down, is the variable that makes the Kurdish front potentially the most consequential thing about this war that nobody outside the specialized analysts has fully accounted for. The ceasefire talks in Oman are the immediate variable that determines whether that window stays open or closes. A negotiated settlement that restores the Islamic Republic's financial stability, reduces the American military pressure on its security forces, and allows Iran to turn its attention back to its western border would close the window in the near term. A collapse of those talks, a return to sustained American airstrikes, a deepening of the Karg Island oil blockade, and a continuation of the economic deterioration that has been accumulating since February 28th would keep the window open and force the coalition's commanders to revisit the calculation about whether the conditions for a scaled offensive had arrived. The Palladium magazine analysis that described the Kurdish offensive as having unraveled used that word to describe March 2026. It did not describe what would happen in August or September if the talks fail and the pressure on the Islamic Republic intensifies rather than eases. The coalition exists. The fighters are there. The population inside Iranian Kurdistan has spent 4 years living with the aftermath of 2022. The Islamic Republic's ground forces are intact, but its wider apparatus is under strain that no previous episode in its 45-year history has produced. Ready but waiting is the posture for now. The now is contingent on a set of conditions that are changing daily, in a war that has already produced more surprises than anyone predicted when it began. One final thread that has not received the attention it deserves in international coverage of the Kurdish dimension, the specific role of women fighters in this conflict, and what it represents strategically. PJAC's armed wing, the YRK, is assessed by outside analysts as fielding the most capable fighters in the coalition, and a significant proportion of those fighters are women. The YRK's companion organization, the Women's Defense Forces, or HPJ, operates alongside the YRK in the Kandil mountain bases. This is not a token presence. The YRK's reputation for effectiveness in mountain warfare rests partly on the tactical capabilities of its female fighters, who have been operating in these specific mountains for years, and who bring institutional knowledge of the terrain, the border crossings, and the IRGC's operational patterns that is not replicated in any other Kurdish force. The Islamic Republic's response to the symbolism of this is complicated by something specific to the ideology it claims to represent. An Islamic revolutionary state fighting female fighters who are organized under the banner of woman, life, freedom, the slogan of the protests that began with the death of a Kurdish woman in morality police custody, is a more rhetorically difficult fight than an Islamic revolutionary state fighting male Kurdish separatists. The IRGC media, which has been remarkably effective at managing the domestic Iranian narrative about the war with the United States, has barely mentioned the Kurdish front, because the Kurdish front combines almost every element of the regime's most sensitive internal contradictions. The relationship with the Kurdish minority, the legacy of the Amini protests, the presence of armed women fighting under a feminist slogan, and the existence of a Kurdish population inside Iran that, by the regime's own historical logic, should have been fully integrated into the Islamic Republic's social fabric after 45 years, and clearly has not been. That is what thousands of Kurdish fighters just did to Iran. Not a single dramatic offensive that broke a front line, but the creation of a coalition, the maintenance of ongoing operations inside western Iran, the survival of Iranian preemptive strikes on their headquarters, the preservation of a credible military presence in the mountains, while the primary war was fought on other fronts, and the patient construction of the conditions under which a much larger and more consequential action might eventually become possible. Ready but waiting is a military posture and a political statement simultaneously. The coalition is announcing to the Islamic Republic, to the Kurdish population inside Iran, to the United States, and to whoever eventually negotiates whatever ends this war, that the Kurdish question in Iran did not disappear when the bombs started falling on Tehran. It became more urgent.